Good afternoon to everybody in Europe, and if others are dialed in from other places around the world, evening to you. So I'm Deborah Grassgreen. I'm the president of the International Insolvency Institute, and I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to our second panel on COVID measures regarding EMEA. And we've got some terrific panelists. We've had a number of these presentations in this series that the NextGen program has put on, and it's just been really wonderful to see how the members of III and the members of the NextGen have stepped forward in this time when our profession and what we're doing is so important to helping the world recover from this pandemic. And so I want to thank everyone for putting this together. I want to welcome everyone. I know we're going to have another great presentation. I want to encourage everyone. We're in a time in the Institute where there are no rules for what we're doing. We obviously cannot have our annual meeting, which is an opportunity for everyone to get together in person and share ideas and connect with other members of NextGen and the III from around the world. But in lieu of that, we're having these virtual meetings, and hopefully there'll be a time when we can meet together in person, either on a regional level or worldwide. But until then, no idea is too small, and we should all be creative about the things that we can do to stay connected. So thank you to the organizers and the panelists, and I look forward to a terrific panel.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you to the III and the NextGen program. I am Francesca Burigo. I am a NextGen member of International Insolvency Institute Class 8, and I will moderate this panel. Well, today the discussion will involve 4 speakers coming from France, Germany, Spain, and Italy. Let me introduce them shortly. Mylene Bochet Robinet is a lawyer at the Paris bar. She has founded her own boutique law firm ranked as leading firm band 1 in restructuring and insolvency by Leaders League in France. She has developed specific expertise in cross-border restructurings, in particular in cases involving France and Germany. She teaches insolvency international law at the University of Lyon. She participated in the creation of the NextGen in 2012, so Class 1, and joined III as member in 2019. Mylene is the co-founder and president of Women in Restructuring, the French Women's Restructuring Network. Then we have Jose Carles, that is a founding partner of Carles Cuesta Abogados in Spain, where he is also co-head of the Business Recovery, Restructuring and Insolvency Group. He is a member of the advisory board of the Restructuring and Insolvency section of Madrid's Bar Association, co-chair of the Insol Europe's Legal Tech and Digital Assets Wing, and professor in Restructuring and Insolvency Law. He is one of the American Bankruptcy Institute under 40 emerging leaders in insolvency practice, and was included among names to know in Spain 2020 by Global Restructuring Review. Then we have Christian Hilpert. He is partner at Havershad Sutherland in Germany and head of the German restructuring practice. Christian advises on restructurings and insolvency situations with a specific emphasis on cross-border transactions and cases. He has also more than 10 years of experience in advising on the acquisition and the sale of assets of distressed companies and portfolios. Christian studied law at the University of Münster, holds a PhD from Saarland University, and a master's degree in business administration, MBA Diplôme d'études supérieures de gestion, from the European Institute in Saarbrücken. Christian is a certified restructuring advisor and a solicitor admitted in England and Wales. And finally, we have Luciano Panzani. Judge Panzani has been president of the Court of Appellate of Rome since 2014 to February 2020. President of the First Instance Court of Torino, judge of the First Chamber of the Supreme Court of Cassazione. He served as insolvency judge for many years. He is expert in commercial and company law and in competition law. He was member of the committee appointed in February 2015 and again in 2017 from the Italian Ministry of Justice to update the Italian insolvency law. Judge Panzani is member of the III and has been member of the board. In 2015, received from the Institute the Outstanding Contribution Award. Contributor of many law Italian reviews and author of many publications in insolvency and company law. He has been teacher in universities such as Torino, Rome, Siena, Nicaragua, Russia, Romania, and Arizona. Judge Panzani is frequently called as speaker in meetings on insolvency law in Italy and abroad. Well, these are our speakers, but before starting with the program, please let me give some instructions for all the attendees. If any of you want to ask questions during the session, please write them in the Q&A section of Zoom. At the end of the webinar, some minutes have been reserved to them. The video of the session will be uploaded on the III website as happened with the previous webinars. Well, let's start now with the first general overview on the situation of France, Spain, and Germany in order to catch the main general protocols adopted. I asked to Mylene to tell us what happened in France.
Okay, thank you, Francesca. Just the situation in France in 2 minutes. So we had a strict lockdown mid-March in France with a shutdown of all non-essential public activities of firms. So many firms were closed and we had home confinement for individual people. And we had a progressive exit of the lockdown period as from May 11th, but it was very, very progressive. So we speak about phases in the exit. Phase 1 was in May. So people could go out from home, but with certificate, could not leave the area or make more than 100 kilometers. So May was not really freedom. And as from yesterday in France, we entered into phase 2. So it is not total freedom in Paris because, and in France, because there are still some restrictions, but people, individuals can circulate, firms start again, restaurants and cafes reopen, outside only in Paris. But the situation is really, really different in France. And so yesterday evening when I left my firm, I was really, really happy to see how many people we had on the terraces of cafes and restaurants outside. But the travel, unfortunately, was not that nice, because maybe you have heard that yesterday in Paris we had big riots with more than 20,000 demonstrators in the street. So don't worry, the Gilets jaunes are not back, but this is demonstrations for situations similar as George Floyd in the US. So this is the situation in France and in Paris.
Thank you, Mylene. And what is happening in Spain, Jose?
Well, in Spain, there are some parts that are very similar to those that Mylene pointed out in France. We started the state of alarm on the 14th of March. It's already been almost 3 months. We're still in the state of alarm, and actually currently, just now, they are voting another extension here in Spain until the 21st of June. So it's expected it will be approved, and then we will still have limitations. Also, as in France, we have phases program, and it's different in the regions in Spain. The area of Madrid, Barcelona, the city of Barcelona, and the area north to Madrid, it's still in phase 1, so we're allowed to do less things than they are in other regions of Spain. But life is getting back to normal. You can already see, even in Madrid, in one of those previous cases, you can already see people eating in restaurants or going out, always outside, not inside, entering into shops, like doing a line and with many restrictions, but little by little, we are starting to get normal. So that's more or less the situation in Spain. The sectors that have suffered the most are hospitality, the automotive sector, and the retail and upper retail sectors.
Thank you, Cosette. And Christian, what can you tell us about the German situation?
I think it's pretty similar, to be honest. So being a federal state, it depended a little bit on where you were living, but generally end of March, mid of March, the first federal states started with lockdown protocols that went up until early May, some of them a little later. And we are now also in a phase 2. The phase 1 was very similar to France, except that we were in theory allowed to move as long as you kept to social distancing. Factually, people stayed at home. Everybody was a bit cautious. The economy was shut, no cafes, nothing that was not urgently required, like supermarkets. They kept open, but cafes, restaurants, whatever social life you might have just got shut down. And a lot of pieces of the economy actually also got shut down. The German OEMs, automotive producers, they shut their factories for 4 weeks, which of course has had a significant impact. And I think it's now the phase where especially the economy is looking back and trying to see what damage that has caused. There are educated guesses that that might end up somewhere with 25%. But yeah, I think it's a bit too early to tell probably.
Thank you. The Italian current situation has been illustrated last week by Domenico Benincasa, so there are no particular changes to add. Let's see now how all the countries are looking for the best way to cope with the COVID-19 and all the matters correlated to the lockdown and its impact on the economic side. One of the most implemented measures taken by the government concerns financing measures for enterprises and other actions aimed at fostering the credit. In France has been introduced a possibility to ask for a particular state-guaranteed loan. Is it right, Mylene? May you illustrate this measure and explain if it's efficient according to you or not?
Okay, thank you. So yes, in France we have our state-guaranteed loan. This is called PGE, Prêt Garanti par l'État. So it's quite a normal loan granted to undertakings by their usual commercial banks, but a loan with a guarantee from the state up to 90% of the loan amount. So this is basically the PGE. This PGE is granted with very, very low interest rates. This is a loan capped in its amount depending on the size of the company. Basically speaking, the reimbursement is deferred in time. Actually, the where we are now is this PGEs. What is the situation? What is the result? In March, the government announced PGEs for approximately, or financial aids for approximately 300 million euros. And I understand that the situation as at mid-May was that 100 million euros PGEs had been granted to approximately 500,000 French undertakings. So we still have possibilities to firms in need for financial assistance. I would like just to make actually one comment on PGEs with respect to eligibility criteria. So the conditions upon which an undertaking can have access to a PGE, to a state guaranteed loan. You may be aware that the conditions and the criteria are given by the European law in the EU zone. A PGE, a state guaranteed loan, is considered as being a state aid and they are the restrictions imposed by the European Commission to member states with respect to the granting of state aid. So the legal framework for PGEs is a European one, including the conditions for access, the eligibility criteria. And initially, French law related to PGE was not 100% aligned with the EU legal framework. We were a little bit more restricted to firms, and this has been changed by the government rather recently, but this concerns in particular firms in difficulties. So basically, and maybe firms subject to insolvency proceedings. The situation or the conditions given by the EU Commission that was given in a combination of an EU regulation and a specific note sent by the Commission to France, to the French government, was that a firm in insolvency proceedings at the end of 2019 could not benefit, is not eligible to a PGE. This was not French law at the beginning. This has been changed, and now the situation is the following, that firms which have been subject to the opening of insolvency proceedings as from January 2020 are eligible to a PGE. So this is one of the criteria, but it's already a good thing because no French law is aligned and the situation is really more flexible to firms in difficulties. That's the theoretical situation, but what happens in practice? I mean, it's really nice to be eligible in theory, but if the banks do not grant money, it's useless. And there is a real problem to firms in difficulties to have access, to have a concrete access to that kind of financial aid. I mean, based on the experience I have and other people around me in the restructuring area have, firms in difficulties do not have real access to PGs. It's really hard, and it is as if firms will be condemned twice. They had the first restructuring. Sometimes they are under a plan, they are eligible to a PG, but it's really too difficult to have access to PG in practice. So this was just one comment I wanted to make to emphasize on PG in France.
Well, so a strange situation at the end. And Jose, which are the options for a Spanish company to put new financial resources in the business?
We also have, like in France, state guaranteed loans. The total amount that was decided by the government was 100,000 million. So that's a limit. It's lower than what Mylene stated for France. What they have done is they have liberated it tranche by tranche, normally 20,000 million tranches. And so far they have released 4. The thing is, only the first one was very useful, like companies had access to it. We had the problem in Spain, we actually have it with every tranche, but companies under insolvency are not eligible. So they actually, when they sign the papers, they have to state that they are not under current insolvency. So even if there's not an obligation to file for insolvency right now in Spain, they are not eligible if they are actually under an insolvency situation. That's the state aid also, like Mylene stated for France. So there are the limitations that Mylene also stated. And the practical problem with these loans is that, well, only the first tranche really worked. Because even if some of the others have been granted by the banks, they are not being released by the Instituto de Crédito Oficial, which is the one who has to sign the guarantees. So companies are not obtaining the liquidity, which was what it was made for, only the ones in the first tranche. And the ones in the first tranche that actually got it, it was a critic in Spain that many companies were obtaining it without banks really considering if they were really viable or not. The guarantee is between 60% and 80%, depending on the size of the enterprise that asks for the loan. It's 80% normally for smaller sized companies. And also it depends on the purpose of the loan. If it's real liquidity, it goes up to that 80%. If it's just to refinance a previous debt, it would be a total of a maximum of 60%. The other way of getting financing these days is through shareholders. The problem in Spain, like in other jurisdictions, is that when shareholders or directors or any related persons to the company cash money in the company, their claims are considered normally subordinated in Spain. So what has been done in Spain is that if a company is already under insolvency proceedings and under an arrangement with creditors that's negotiated within the court, they put money in, and it's stated in the scheme of or in the arrangement with creditors, then it would be a claim against the state. So it's actually making these especially related persons to have an incentive to put money. While if there's no insolvency, instead of being subordinated, the money they put in, if the company is finally insolvent, would be considered in that insolvency proceedings as an ordinary claim instead of subordinated. What has been criticized is that why was there that difference? If we really want to incentivize shareholders or directors to get involved in the company and put money, maybe it should have been considered in both cases claim against the state instead of making that difference.
Thank you, Jose. And in Germany, Christian, what is the way to finance in COVID time enterprises?
I think there is a mixture of a couple of things we've already heard, and I would basically say there are 6 areas and would like to touch it a bit broader. So one of the things is the tax deferral, which you could get, which of course has an immediate effect on your liquidity. We've had large concepts of short-term labor, which sound much more interesting than they were, especially at the beginning, because it took you approximately 6 to 8 weeks until you got the refinancing back. So until that became an effective measure. We've seen suspension of the director's duties to file for insolvency under certain conditions, plus, as Jose managed, a privilege of shareholder finance, which you would normally be able to claw back in certain scenarios. There were privileges being given. Then we've seen let's say, certain federal states going for certain specific measures like self-employed people where local funds have been appointed. And then there is the large basket of loan funding plus a stabilization mechanism, which has now been put in place. So the loan funding will largely depend. In theory, you got access, but still we also see the problem with industries in distress that they do not qualify, generally done via your local bank. So your standard bank, what we are seeing is they are still running a standard credit check, which of course is a problem. It's a time-consuming thing. In the meantime, the governments have backed that up to 100%. Some of the federals have done that straight away, which of course speeds up the process. But there's still a lot of struggling on these loans. And then there's something particular which I would like to mention, because it also went through the press as Lufthansa just went under a state ownership partially. There is a stabilization mechanic installed with 500 billion. And there are 400 billion of that which should be used for guarantees and 100 billion used for refinancing certain companies once the immediate measures are done. I think that's a pretty interesting concept. However, it sounds much smarter than what we're hearing in practice, because it's actually the politics giving the money. And what we're hearing is that they are tending to tie that to certain conditions, which normally are not economically driven. So there's certain things, covenants imposed on them. And that's actually, again, a delay in the process. I think some people might have read the story about Lufthansa, which went forth and back. Yeah, but I think that's where we currently stand. So the emergency measures, they have worked. The combination of the measures is what has actually saved most, I would say. Is the pain over? Is the situation solved? Not at all. Will the fund be sufficient? Not at all. So we are expecting that the full problem will incur because loans need to be repaid, they need to be paid back, they have an effect on your balance sheet, on the over-indebtedness, which can trigger a filing duty under German law. So we are seeing and actually expecting a lot of things to happen later this year when the whole scenario will get much more clearer.
Thank you, Christian. Even the Italian government provided some specific emergency legislation on this point, and in some cases with a particular attention to specific sectors or companies. So, Luciano, what are the relief measures taken in Italy and the main issues related to them?
Well, I should start saying that the situation in Italy is not so different from France. And what Mylene said before about the limits to the funding of enterprises coming from the European Union legislation are common to all the European countries, and so to France like to Italy. The Italian government decided to set funds and loans for about 400 billion euros. But of course, this sum is the result of a financial leverage. So I mean, the loans are coming from the banks, from commercial bank like in France, and commercial bank will have the guarantee of the state. So more or less there is something like a certain percentage between 10 and 30% that is money given by the banks, and the rest is given by the state through the guarantee. And it means there is a certain time for to study the situation of the enterprise. And of course, if the enterprise has problems, it's more difficult. And it's forbidden anyways to help enterprises who had already a difficult situation before the COVID crisis. So these are quite important limits. And then, of course, you have different situations when the funds, the loans are provided to very big enterprises. The case that is quite similar to Lufthansa case is the FCA. FCA asked a loan of about 6 billion euros, and a few weeks before, in the framework of the merger with PSA, FCA announced a distribution to the shareholders of 3 billion euros. It means that between the political parties, there was people who were discussing the idea to help FCA. But of course, one operation, the merge, is decided by the holding, that is not an Italian company, and the other one, the loan, is asked by the sub-holding that is Italian. More than this, there are the problem that the loan have a purpose, must be directed to pay salaries, to pay suppliers, and so on, not to do financial operation. So there are problems, and part of these problems have, as a result, times that are not so quick as were announced by the government at the beginning when these measures were announced. This is one of the provision accorded by the different government decrees approved then by the parliament, confirmed by the parliament. And part of this provision are still not working. For instance, one of the most important is a special patrimony destinated assets trusted by the state to Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. Cassa Depositi e Prestiti is a company owned by the state, and this fund, about 50 billion of euros, must be invested in companies with a turnover of more than 50 million euros. So we still have to see how this fund will work. And so I've seen in the chat that someone was asking me if Italy will employ the recovery fund, European Recovery Fund. We still don't know if the fund will be approved by European Union. So this discussion is perhaps too early to be held. But anyways, I should say, yes, of course, totally the amount of money that will be needed to help the economy, it will be much more than people could imagine at the beginning of this crisis. And this measure we are discussing now are the first ones that were taken, and we have to see in the future what will happen. It's a quite interesting experience. I would like only to say that Alitalia situation is quite different, because the Alitalia crisis was coming from the past. And so the recovery of Alitalia is out of the exception to the state aids limits that the European Commission was able to grant to all the European countries after the COVID. And so now the Italian government is discussing with the Commission how to is possible to help Alitalia. I have not the time to discuss technical point on this topic, but it's a very special situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Luciano. Christian, and what is the situation of financial aids in Germany? Is it effective in your opinion? Are there specific sectors or companies which receive particular help, except what you said about Lufthansa?
I think you need to split the answer a bit. And it's interesting that exactly one question on the conditions came through, which I'll touch directly. I think let's focus on the stabilization mechanics, which is designed for the larger companies. So you will need to have a balance sheet of 43 million, revenues up over 50, and at least approximately 259 employees in the last year. So that's for the larger companies. However, that is, of course, an effect on certain industries in Germany which are suffering distress. We are seeing the hospitality industry in distress, of course. We are seeing aviation being a problem, of course, for obvious reasons. But there is the large German portion in Germany, which is automotive, which through its supply chains then goes into Eastern Europe and is kind of the backbone of the German economy, I would call it, or like to call it. And some of these, let's say, large mid-size tier 1, tier 2 producers, they in theory should qualify for that. However, what we're seeing is that, of course, the automotive industry largely is an industry in distress already for a couple of years. So that's not something new, quite comparable to the Alitalia problem. There are reasons why they are there. However, they are still hit very, very hard. And we are also seeing that when these recapitalization measures are being implemented, the states got a lot of flexibility under the fund to participate even in equity to a certain amount. That conditions, environmental conditions, social conditions, the green conditions and similar stuff are trying to be imposed. So a political agenda. Which for a company in such a situation might be a difficult thing because it directly might affect its business model. So they might get funding, and at the same time they've got conditions which will make use of that funding more or less straight away. So there are a lot of discussions going on. The Lufthansa discussion has gone through the press a lot, so that's an open book, and most people who have followed it will have seen that it went forth and back, that there was a rejection threat with insolvency filings, but we're seeing very similar discussions on a, let's say, larger company level, especially in the automotive industry happening. However, you should be aware that there is, because of the federal systems, certain federal states tend to protect their industry, where the automotive industry is in particular strong. That's, for example, for parts of Bavaria. So even if there are, let's say, conditions imposed which companies don't like or think they can't live with or touches their business model, there might be a workaround by using, let's say, the lower level state aid, so the federal state aid, instead of the large governmental funds available. And we're actually seeing, I think it's a bit too early to say if it's successful. I think the combination of the measures has not yet triggered what would have happened without these measures. But a success, in my view, is a midterm or long-term perspective even, and a loan stays a loan, so you need to earn the money to pay it back. If you can't do that and your business model is affected for other reasons, well, you're just buying yourself time. And I think that's kind of how we are looking at it, and why we are a bit careful with judging whether that has been a success. I would say it has prevented the worst from happening immediately, but I have personal doubts that it'll prevent an increase of the insolvency filing numbers.
Thank you, Christian. It's true what you say. The impact of the emergency measures in these countries affects those situations in which a restructuring proceeding is ongoing or an insolvency proceeding needs to be opened. So, Mylene, what's the French response?
Okay, so yes, the situation with respect to firms in difficulties and in insolvency courts. In France, we have no specific insolvency courts. We have our commercial courts. So the situation is the following. I can say that the French way is like compromise between the answer given by the Netherlands on this topic, i.e., no change in the opening of insolvency proceedings, and the answer given by Italy, which is, if I'm not wrong, a total freeze in the opening of insolvency proceedings. So in France, what have we done? The government has simply frozen the assessment of the insolvency test. The French insolvency test is the cessation of payment. This is a cash flow test. We do not have any balance sheets test, as contrary to Germany, for instance. So the situation is the following. If an undertaking falls insolvent after March 12th, there is no more duty to the management to file for the opening of insolvency proceedings. There is no duty to file, and also there is no possibility for creditors or public prosecutor to request the opening of involuntary insolvency proceedings against an insolvent debtors. This is a freeze in the duty to file, but it does not mean that the debtor, the insolvent debtor, cannot file at all. It remains a possibility for the debtor, and the opening of insolvency proceeding can be a good thing for the company, can be an advantage because of the stay of payments, because the wages can be advanced by the state's guarantee. So in certain cases, this can remain, this option remains a viable option, an interesting option for firms. And that's why we have seen in the press insolvency proceedings of major companies such as La Halle, Camailleux, etc., especially in the retail industry. So this was the situation. What you need maybe to keep in mind is that we also have in France amicable proceedings. So these are our preventive proceedings, not necessarily the ones prescribed by the EU directive. This is something very specific in France: amicable proceeding, mandat ad hoc, conciliation, consisting in the appointment of a judicial administrator, usually in a confidential framework to assist the management to define solutions to these difficulties. So preventive proceedings, amicable proceedings were still or are still available to firms. And I would say, you know, firms in troubles should really use this this management tool, which are fabulous, which are really fabulous to help them. We have, I do not think we have national statistics, but based on my experience, there has been no big wave in insolvency proceedings due to this temporary regime, but people expect a wave, a significant increase in the opening of insolvency proceedings after the end of the emergency period, and the end of the protection periods will be early October. So we can wait for many insolvencies as from the autumn in France.
Well, thank you. And what happens in Spain, Jose?
Well, first of all, I would like to address very shortly what's happening in the courts, like what's the situation in practice. Since the 14th of March, which was the beginning of the state of alarm, like there was a lockdown, judges and clerks couldn't go to court. So the activity in courts has been kind of completely paralyzed until the 4th of June, which is actually tomorrow. Terms are totally suspended, and they will reinitiate their term after tomorrow, with some even extensions after tomorrow. We have seen that in the last days, we have already started getting some rulings from courts. So the activity that's not like to be there in presence, it's starting to work again. But of course, any hearings or anything that required personal presence in the courts did not work. I've seen some cases in which even video conference was requested, but the courts in Spain don't really have the means. So I've seen it almost always denied. And commercial courts are now working on several systems in order to provide that for the future, but it still doesn't work. Like Circuit, it's a system we are trying in Andalusian commercial courts. Regarding the restructurings that we have, it's also, as Mylene said, in Spain we have a suspension of the obligation to file. That doesn't mean that companies do not have the possibility to file. They do. Most of them even should, because it's actually something that would help. But it's true that until the 31st of December, there's no obligation to file, and therefore creditors cannot force the insolvency of a debtor. The big changes that we have had given to COVID, due to specific regulation for COVID, is that in insolvency proceedings that already had seen how an arrangement with creditors was approved, normally under insolvency or insolvency Spanish law, if the debtor cannot comply with the terms of that arrangement with creditors, they would be obliged to file for liquidation, so no second chance. Now, a change that has been introduced due to COVID is that rearrangement with creditors could be a solution, and it's possible. So the law doesn't provide that the company has to liquidate compulsorily. It gives the creditors the possibility to again vote and decide. And the other big change, given not formal insolvency proceedings, but informal out-of-court restructurings and refinancing agreements, is that normally when one was approved, the year after that, you wouldn't be able to get another one approved. You wouldn't be able to request it, or like to request it or to modify it, anything. And now, due to COVID, you can either request it to be modified or it or just a new one. And it's, for example, what would be expected from Abengoa, like it's a case everyone knows. Actually, Abengoa did a second restructuring last year after the big one in 2015-16. So it would be expected, they have already announced that they will need some other measures. It's true that the year just elapsed, but well, some other companies will also beneficiate or profit from these new possibilities given to COVID.
Thank you, Bochet. And now I would like to ask to Mylene and to Christian that have an experience on cross-border restructurings, which are the main problems in this kind of dealings in this period of COVID.
I start? Okay.
Mylene.
Just one brief comment so that I see the timing. Just one comment, because I see in certain cases where when we have mother company based in other countries, for instance in Germany, and a subsidiary in France, usually the restructuring or the crisis plan, the COVID-19, is defined at the level of the parent company. And sometimes the management of the subsidiary, I would not say is not passive, but relies on the fundings to be obtained at the level of the mother company. And there is a risk in case the plan in Germany or the parent company's level fail. What will happen? The whole group will fall insolvent, the French subsidiary will fall insolvent, file for the opening of insolvency proceedings, and the court can question the French management, saying, okay, what did you do? Did you request a PGE? And the answer was really tricky, because the management has to show that he had an active behavior, and that actually, in addition to the strategy defined at the parent company level, Plan A, the French management also defined an alternative scenario, a Plan B, with PGE, with a short time working, with all measures which are available and which are massive. So it is really, really important not to rely, not to stick too much on one plan at the group level, but also to make contingency planning in the time of the COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, I think, Mylene, I would like to step in and confirm that that's very true. That's also true, or even sometimes worse, if you've got US parents, for example, so that even plans within groups or certain regions are not even attached to the local regimes, not taking into consideration that different regimes, for example, exist in Europe. I think I'll briefly, cautious of time, touch on one point which links into that. That's cross-border cash pooling. It's one of the things which not a lot of people are aware of, but that directly goes to the heart of national jurisdiction combined with international finance structures. So, for example, under German law, we've seen quite a lot of problems out of these cross-border cash pools. For example, well, you can of course see breach of covenants if they're refinanced, private equity refinance and all that stuff. But the problem actually sits on the level below, because the directors, at least under German law, like in many other jurisdictions, got certain duties if they participate in such thing. For example, they need to make sure that the claim they are creating is valid. Well, what do you do if your parent or the cash pool leader is being hit hard by COVID and you actually don't know? You probably don't even get the information. There are things like protection and conservation of share capital. That can even include criminal liabilities and all that stuff. And I think it's at the same time a very, very difficult situation for a director to be in, because you're just the director of the small German subsidiary or local subsidiary, and you're now saying, well, I need to stop that because I've been advised to stop that. Yeah, that'll not be appreciated probably. So it's something we've seen. Approximately 70 to 80% of the cash pools we've been looking at, that there were issues. So if somebody is in practice and has to deal with them, look at them very, very carefully. So I think we are a bit running out of time. So I would cut it off here and return to you, Francesca.
No, thank you so much to Mylene and to Christian for these insights on important issues that you can face in your work, in your job. In this last part of the session, the focus is on the horizon after the COVID-19. And every crisis, we know, shakes the ordinariness, but in the meantime, brings opportunities for progress. This is an extraordinary chance to improve even the insolvency law in each country. So I would like firstly to ask to Luciano, which are the critical points in your opinion for the situation of in the jurisdiction of Italy?
Well, first of all, COVID crisis arrived when Italy did the biggest reform of the insolvency law since 1942. And we had a new code with 400 articles. And I was member of the committee who prepared the code. And so all of you can imagine what was my reaction when the government decided to postpone the entry on force of the code of 1 year. But anyways, it was a necessity, because to oblige the court to fight from one side with the problems of the crisis, on the other side with a new code, with all the problems that comes up with a new legislation, it was really difficult. But just after the closing of this period, the government wants to put on force the code. And in these days, some small changes to the code has been already sent to the Parliament for the approval of the Justice Committee of both the chambers of the Parliament. So it's clear that it is the intention of the government to go on with the code. And I see problems because we have now differences between the legislation, the emergency legislation we had in these days, and some of the principles of the code. The first and biggest problems is the discipline of the so-called alert. I think that Mylene can understand very well, because as a matter of fact, we copied in part the French experience, and alert means preliminary negotiation. So you can imagine how it's difficult to negotiate when all the commercial structure and entrepreneurial activity has to deal with the crisis. So this is the problem. But in these days, approving one of the last decrees of the government, the Parliament introduced a new provision in the law that is quite interesting. I can't give you the details, it's too technical, but the result is that instead to go to the court and to have a term, to present a plan, and then if you are not able to present the plan in this term, you can ask that the term is postponed, but at the end you risk to be declared bankrupt and to go to the liquidation. Instead of all of this, you can renounce to the proceeding, and you can only present an agreement reached outside the court with the creditors. And but in the meantime, you have the stay, the automatic stay. You have the possibility of the priority for financing what in US is called the deep financing. And so is quite a new experience. I don't know really if this provision, that is a provision for this period of emergency, will be kept with the coming back to the normal activity. The other problem is that all the courts in this period were more or less were frozen. I did a small inquiry. I called the president of the insolvency chamber of the first instance court of Milan and Rome, and they are working for the more important cases. I am speaking about restructuring, not liquidation. But anyways, it's clear that in the next month we'll have a much more bigger number of cases. And so we have to see if the judicial system will be able to deal with all these cases. And this, I think, is a serious problem. The government is saying they have to invest in all the structure of the state, and so to improve also the efficiency of the justice system. We have to see.
Thank you. And Jose, I know that even in Spain, an insolvency law reform was ready. What happened then?
Yes, actually in Spain, the opposite to Italy happened. We had a law that was more or less ready, and in the end it was passed during the COVID times, like apart from the specific reforms to deal with COVID, we have a recast Insolvency Act, which was passed like this past month. And basically it will enter into force on the 1st of September. And I would just not enter into the content of it, but we still have work to do to adapt it to the EU directive. So maybe we should have waited. Maybe we should have also waited because, as in Italy, it would make sense that in these times of uncertainty, we wouldn't have introduced a little bit more of uncertainty, but well, we will have to work with what we have. And we will not have to forget that the measures introduced because of COVID will last until even 2022. So even if we have a recast code, we will never have to forget that there are two legislations already. So the recast text is already not recast, but well, that's more or less it. If there are any questions regarding the content of the reform, I would be glad if the speakers send them to me directly or something after the webinar.
Well, thank you, Jose. And Luciano, do you want to say something about the features in a few words of the reform of the insolvency law that will be enacted in the future in Italy?
Well, I said already, the alert system is the main part of this reform. Then there is the group discipline. There wasn't in Italy an organic discipline of group of company. And then more than this, the proceeding for over-indebtedness. That means not only entrepreneurs, but consumers, physical person, and so on. And this part of the reform is, we need it. We need it in this period of crisis, because we'll have in few months so many people with serious problems, also outside of the commercial activity. So it's quite important to find a way to have the discharge for families, for over-indebted people, and so on. This is, I think, the most serious problem we'll have to deal with.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I think that you gave a fantastic overview about the situation in your countries and about the development of some issues, for example, the insolvency law reforms that Spain and Italy, for example, are facing at the moment. I'm looking at the question answer section, but I think that you have been so good to answer to anyone. So I can close. I thank all the speakers. I thank the IIII and the NextGen to giving us this opportunity. And I'm waiting for the next panel that is tomorrow afternoon, and that will involve the Asia region. So Carlo, it's up to you. Thank to everybody. Have a nice afternoon. Arrivederci.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.